What is the most fucked up thing you've seen your parents do? When I was a little kid, probably around 10, my mom told me to send her checkbooks in the mail that belonged to my grandmother. My mom didn't live with us, and she told me that my grandmother had asked me to send them since she was out of town, so I did. I later got sat down by my grandmother, and she was furious with me for sending the books. My mother had apparently done this in order to commit fraud and had drained my grandmother's life savings from close to $1 million down to nothing. I got blamed for it until my grandmother passed away. One of her last conversations with me at age 24 was her still expressing her disappointment in me for sending the books. My mother denies the whole thing to this day. Why did your grandmother believe a 10-year would commit fraud? I think my grandmother was deflecting the blame because she didn't want to face the reality that her only child continuously tried to steal her money. I don't think she really blamed me. I was the catalyst. Did your grandmother report this to the police? You were not a catalyst. You were a blameless child. I'm sorry your grandmother tried to pin any of this on you. Stepmom purposely falsely accused me twice of stealing from her. First time she told me she was going to do it to get my dad to cut off paying for my college and kick me out. It worked. Second time she accused me of what would have been a felony amount to try to get me thrown in jail. Luckily it didn't work out for her that time. Dang, sad to hear that. How did your dad know that your stepmom was lying? And did he think that she must have lied the first time as well? How did it affect their relationship? Just curious. I don't think it was the dad the second time. It was probably a court not believing her. As far as I know they still believe I stole money both times. I just got really lucky the second time and had an alibi for when they said I stole it, but they still believe I did it somehow. They are quite happy and together still, especially with my stepmom getting her wish of me essentially being out of the family. I very rarely speak to them and don't want to at all. My mom is a good person. She's my best friend in the entire world now, and I'd do anything for her. But she's a pushover. She wouldn't defend her children from her now ex-husband if he killed them, while my stepdad would slap my little brother till he was purple, read my journal out loud to humiliate me, choke me in a rage, rip my toys apart, whip my brother with metal hangers, put my cat outside during a hurricane. I never saw her again because he was tired of her meowing. Mom would be standing aside and just watching it happen. Then she'll justify it like, well, if you didn't have an attitude, or the cat was being annoying. To her sobbing children. I don't know. Somehow her just standing there and watching the abuse was worse than the abuse itself. How do you consider her your best friend after she blamed you for the abuse you suffered? Not trying to pass judgment, just wanting to understand. My parents gave my older sister up to child services because they didn't want to take care of her anymore. Yuch, how did it end up like that? Is the problem with your sister causing problems? Or were it your parents who just couldn't parent? Or is it just that your parents just didn't want to because they just didn't want to? If so, any idea why? I'm curious. A typo. She had gotten into some serious trouble a few times. I believe with that, the mental illnesses she had, and she was my parents' first child. With all that, I believe my parents didn't know how to deal with any of it. That's not so great to hear. Luckily you turned out fine, I think. I'm okay. I didn't get into trouble like she did, but we all have our problems. I was raised by my mother. Last Thanksgiving, which was the only time I have ever seen my father on a holiday, I don't know. Tried to find something we had in common to discuss. I'm transgender. My father grew up outside of Boston and I lived in Boston for years. He asked me if I had ever been to this super old trans drag bar in the city. I told him yes. Very casually, he told me about how, as a teenager around 1960, he liked to hang out outside of this establishment and rob patrons at gunpoint while they left. Because of the era, these people had no police protection. I've sometimes thought about sharing this story. I've sometimes thought about offering to share my father's address to any LGBT elders along with it. Lol. I told this story before, but when I was a little I was playing on the porch of my house with a friend of mine. We had cap guns that we were pretending to shoot at each other. My dad saw us from the window, rushed out. He was livid. He grabbed the cap gun from my hand and smashed it on the railing of the porch and told me to get inside. After that I was not allowed to have toy guns and I didn't know why. All I knew was that I had never seen my dad that upset in my life. When I was in my 20s, my mom told me that when my dad was a teenager a friend of his shot himself in the head in front of my dad and a bunch of their friends. I finally understood why he was so upset seeing me and my friend shooting at each other with these guns that looked pretty realistic aside from the orange tip. Once while my sister and I were upstairs, my parents were fighting really loud downstairs. Suddenly, we hear complete silence. My sis and I came out of our rooms at exactly the same time to go see what was going on. We rushed down the stairs and saw my father choking my mother. She stayed with him for approximate 10 years after that. Oh, and the day after that happened, we all went on a happy vacation, with my mother pretending nothing had happened and instructing us to do the same. Thanks all for the replies with well wishes, shared stories and words of encouragement. It's been overwhelming. I'm sorry if I didn't answer your comment. At a certain point, I had to step away from it. I hope you all understand. I have way too many dark ones, so I'm going to go with something kind of funny. So my mom spent about a month in a mental health ward when I was a kid. When she got out, our neighbors took us to an event where a local winery had jazz concerts on their wine. My mother, not thinking about all the drugs she was on to unfuck her brain, did 4 wine tasting flights and got smashed. She then proceeded to take off her top, spin it over her head, and shake her massive mammaries while hooting the mating call of the drunken redneck woo-woo. When someone tried covering, she did a bob and weave and tried to make a run for it. I got to stand outside of the police station while her husband pissed at her bail. Fun times. My mom and dad have been divorced since I was 1, and despite the fact that I spent approximately an equal amount of time with each of them through my childhood, my mother's house was my legal residence, so I went to school in the town she lived in. During my 8th grade year, I began living with my dad full-time due to years of abuse and neglect by my mom. That following summer my mother moved without telling anyone, leaving me and my dad to either move to the town where my mom lived, which had a great school system and all my friends, or stay where we lived in the most drug-infested town in the county with a considerably worse school system. My dad and I had to find a place and move in less than 2 months. When I was maybe 13, my cousin had a baby and my mom went over to my nana's house to wait for the baby with a butcher knife. She was going to stab my cousin's newborn because she thought it was the Antichrist. Your childhood must have been interesting to say the least. Interesting isn't quite the word I'd use. Well, they say that the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times as a terrible curse to wish on someone. I say they say because there isn't actually evidence that the Chinese actually say that. They probably don't say that because then it would most likely be in Chinese. My mom held a gun to her head when I was 8, threatening suicide when I ran over to her, crying, trying to stop her. She pointed the gun right at my forehead and told me to get away. Never been more scared in my life. She also shot a gun off in the house a few weeks later, had several ropes tied into nooses hanging in her closet, wrote several suicide notes, and would basically threaten to end her life whenever something inconvenienced her. Luckily she's sober and much more stable now, but we don't have a good relationship and I'm still terrified of her to this day. That's completely understandable. When I was in 3rd maybe 4th grade, I was crying in my room on the bed because my mom wouldn't let me go to a neighbor's house. She then proceeded to take a pillow from my bed and hold it over my face, attempting to suffocate me. Luckily, I was smart enough to hold my arms over my face to keep her from doing it. I still hate her for that till this day and I'm 16. She wonders why I don't love her the way I do my dad. Do you still live with her, and does your dad know? Are they together? I hope you are safe and far away from her. She sounds like a psychopath, no offense. I remember when I was about 3 to 4, standing in front of the fireplace with my siblings, and being sad as the fire roared. A few years later, I was told the reason I was sad. It was Christmas morning and my father got a bit peeved when he felt that his children did not express the proper level of happiness at receiving gifts. So, he threw them all into the fire. Years later I asked my mom if we had received a puppy that morning. We had not. Years later I asked my mom if we had received a puppy that morning. We had not. Relieved sigh. When I was maybe in 10th grade one night my stepdad started fighting with my mom, which was normal, but when he started choking her I had to pull him off, only to have him start pounding on me. I was not a large boy and this was a full-grown man. Now, this wasn't the first time that he had hit me, but it was the first time my mom saw the whole thing. Her reaction was to walk slowly upstairs, pausing at the top, to look back at my face, shocked and bleeding, before going into her bedroom and slitting her wrists. I don't think I've ever felt more abandoned than in that moment. You know what? My childhood wasn't that bad. That's what I'm taking from all of this. I have similar feelings. Sure, a little neglect and poor decisions on my parents' part, but I think I'm okay with who I got. Condolences to all in this thread who have suffered. I truly hope they're doing better off nowadays. I feel like my parents didn't deserve me. I'm not a monster, but some people would probably assume I had a slightly messed up childhood, but it's not true. I feel like such a disappointment, but they don't make me feel like one. In a very heated argument my dad locked himself in the bathroom and wouldn't open it despite my mom's wailing and sobbing. She went into their bedroom and shot the ceiling, so he would come out thinking she had shot herself. I heard him threatening to knock her out if she got up, so I ran into there and got between them. Later that night, when they had made up he said he only threatened her because he had to use his phone and prepare to dial 911 if her breakdown continued. He also told her I didn't hear the gunshot, so she wouldn't be embarrassed. Mom threatened to shoot herself over the new dog crapping on the carpet. She's a very all or nothing woman. Her sound for I'm struggling with the peanut butter jar is the same as her sound for someone is currently being murdered. Might have to do with the depression and anxiety that she passed on to me. Sounds like she might have borderline personality disorder. For those who suffer from it, it is very difficult to see things in shades of grey. Everything is black and white, and therefore any negative emotion they have can seem dire, when it's really no big deal.